Welcome to the Spawn Chunks, episode number 332, recorded on Monday, January 13th. This is a podcast all about Minecraft, and if you'd like to watch the video version, it's available on YouTube. If you're listening to audio, it's basically everywhere you get a podcast. My name is Joel Duggan, and joining me, as always, is my friend Jonny. Hello, sir.
Hello. Yes, we've been chatting it up in the pre-show already. We've been talking about Joel's experiences in Stardew Valley this week. So if you're interested in more gaming stuff, if you cast your net a little bit wider than Minecraft, then you might want to listen to The Render Distance. That's the extended version of our podcast, which patrons can listen to from patreon.com/thespawnchunks. That'll give you an RSS feed that'll plug into any of your podcatchers once you become a patron. Changes are coming to Patreon billing soon. Speaking of becoming a patron, we are switching from per episode subscriptions to a monthly subscription model, falling in line with what Patreon wants to do in collaboration with the iOS app. So watch this space. Those changes are in the process of being made right now. We're talking it through with the team at Patreon. So we've been talking about this in the lead up to Christmas, like we were going to do it as soon as the new year launched. We are getting that process started. It's just taking a little bit longer. We also have some upcoming stuff for our patrons to get excited about. Our monthly Minecraft Hangouts are going to resume at the end of January. So patrons are going to let us know what they've been up to in Minecraft that month. We usually have a lot of screenshots and we take a look at what people have been building and what the latest trends in building are, if everyone's jumping on board with pale oakwood now that they've had a month or so to play around with that, or if people are even diving into the snapshots and taking a look at some of the stuff that we'll be talking about later in today's news. We also have quarterly hangouts, one of which is coming up probably at the end of January or beginning of February, where we're going to be talking through the behind-the-scenes facts and figures of the podcast, what the podcast has been performing like across all the platforms where we share it for the last year. We're just going to be recapping the fourth quarter of the year, but also taking a look at the year overall. So if you're curious about how the Spawn Chunks has grown as a podcast over 2024, once again, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thespawnchunks.
So what have you been up to in Minecraft this week, Jonny?
In the survival guide, I have been redesigning my honey farm. After doing a bunch of stuff around my base area, having designed the interior of the factory and done a couple of farms in there, adding to that with pale hanging moss, and doing the blacksmith's interior, both of which I spoke about on last week's show, I'm looking at some of the other stuff around my base area that I think I really need to do something with because they've been sat there for quite a while. There is a sniffer pen where I have 4 sniffers who've just been digging up seeds without anything really collecting them for a while. I want to build a bigger pasture for them, maybe make something aesthetic, but maybe have some allays flying around them and gathering up the seeds. But the main thing I wanted to work on is the honey farm, because the honey collection, the honey bottling facility, and the honeycomb shearing station have both been separate, sort of orphaned builds for a while. They haven't really been builds at all. They've just been the farm with maybe a couple of honey blocks around the outside for decoration, but really no aesthetic decoration to them. So on stream this week, I redesigned the honey farm to auto-craft honey blocks and recycle the glass bottles, because I decided if I was going to house it in something more permanent, I wanted to make sure that the whole system ran a little bit more automatically, where previously I had to go up, craft the honey blocks myself, and refill the bottles, just like throw them into barrels in hoppers at the top. Because I think when I initially designed this, the crafter was just the twinkle in the eye of a Minecraft developer. At that point, I didn't even know auto-crafting was coming to the game. So because the honey and honeycomb farms have been sort of separate, I thought beekeeper's cottage, I'm going to put them both in the right place, and I need to know how big to build that, so I'm going to redesign this honey farm. And it's built in the world right now. It still needs to be populated with bees, but I wanted to start an episode about it where I talk about what I've done. It's really exactly the same as the previous honey farm, just with a comparator reading the amount of honey that's built up in the hive and then triggering a dispenser full of glass bottles to bottle it when it's done. The change is that those bottles, once they are spat out, now go along a line of hoppers, up a water elevator, and into a crafter that's above the farm, because that can simply spit out the block and the 4 empty bottles into a chest. Once that's done, the chest filters down into 2 separate item filters, one of which recycles the bottles by just dropping them off into a water stream that leads to a chain of hoppers over the top of the dispensers, so the bottles just end up going back where they started, and the honey blocks can be siphoned off by the second slice of item filter and go down to a collection barrel that's right in front of the farm. So the design came together really well. I was originally putting all the crafting and stuff underneath the farm, but then some folks in chat suggested maybe just have them go up and then over the top so the bottles just drop down. And I think it made the whole thing feel like the storage and the area where you can see the bees behind the kind of glass blocks that I've got them blocked in with was on the same level. So it felt like something you could go in, see the bees working, and collect the product all in the same place. So I was working on a little creative, like, snapshot diorama around the outside of that, working a bit with resin as well to kind of have little honey drops here and there on the floor, maybe a trough of honey, and a bit of greenery on the inside of the building as well. But none of that is built in survival yet. That was just me mocking it up a little bit, trying to work with a varied color palette, see what I could do with a bit of the foliage in there, and the overall like technical side of things is already built in survival guide and ready to be decorated at my next opportunity. So I've got to do that. I've got to move the honeycomb farm over, but that just needs more storage because as a modular contraption, it's pretty straightforward. And I don't want to auto-craft a bunch of stuff with it because a lot of the time honeycomb, I've got enough blocks of it. I probably have enough candles now, and I want to keep it as raw honeycomb because then I can use it to wax copper, and there are a couple of uses for honeycomb. I think it can also freeze the text on signs as well, stuff like that. I can still do stuff like that with it, that it benefits me to keep it in its raw state, and honeycomb blocks can't be uncrafted into honeycomb again. So instead of setting that up to autocrafters, I'm just going to transplant that into the new house once I have that built, and that'll be all of the honey production, all of the bee farms done in one place.
I do that too with certain blocks that are just either more convenient or better to have in one form or another, even if another form is more condensed, or you think that the end game is to have it as a block when you're like, actually, it might be better to have this as a more flexible kind of like mid-ground stage in the crafting tree. And I'm actually struggling to remember whether we have a data pack on the Citadel that allows you to unpack honeycomb blocks into, or honey blocks into honeycomb, or vice versa, because we've done that with a number of things like netherwort. I want to say, well, Cole does it anyway. There's a couple of other blocks that I think we've done it with.
There's like wool into string. That's a pretty popular one.
Yes,
There's
that's one that we have for sure. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing where like I look at this and I think that's really cool, and that's the kind of thing that I'm looking forward to doing in like the new sci-fi zone, where I might approach it more like a solo area where like I'll pretend like we don't have all the farms already on the server and like maybe build myself a honey farm or a sheep farm or a string farm or whatever. And I'm looking forward to revisiting all those early farms now that we have the crafter, because I had a lot of fun doing the iron farm guts over again with the crafter in mind, to do all the dyes and all the different things that you can get from just an iron farm now. And this is like, I really like the idea of recycling the bottles, and it gives like a very closed chain system and recycled chain system, which you don't get a lot of opportunity to do in Minecraft, which is really, really cool. And it's almost like a little puzzle to solve. And I'm sure you probably felt very satisfied in like how it came together, and the fact that everything's just nice and tidy, and the bottles get recycled and all that kind of stuff. And I'm looking forward to dabbling with the crafter in that way for some of the older farms that you just approach completely differently now that you have, access to a crafter.
Yeah, I was expecting to do a lot of automatic like upgrading with the crafter once it released, and for one reason or another I just haven't. Like I attached it to a couple of farms that I knew, this is going to be really helpful, like auto crafting melon slices back into melons for my melon and pumpkin farm, things like that, when I was demonstrating the crafter's functionality originally. And then for whatever reason, I never followed through with my plans to automate everything in my world. I think long term, I have the plan to make like a big factory somewhere and have that be a place where everything can be auto-crafted. And so for these smaller starter farms, I'm sort of not really considering it. I think some of them don't have a high enough yield to make it worthwhile, really. But aside from attaching it to my iron farm and the melon and pumpkin farm, there are a few places where I just haven't really bothered with the crafter, or the product of that farm has enough different uses that I don't need to, like, I don't want to just have it craft one thing. I would want it to craft like a whole variety of things, like how bamboo, if you auto craft that, can be turned into planks and then sticks and then all of the different wood types, and like you can do a lot with a farm like that if you have like an entire bank of crafters attached to it. I'm enjoying setting it up for things that just have one product that they output. Like, I'm not looking to get sugar from this honey farm, so all it makes is honey blocks. And that's the only thing I need to set it up with, as opposed to filtering 10 different items out of something like a bamboo farm. So for some people, that's like the end goal of the crafter, and that's what they want to do. For me, I think I'm happier doing a lot of that stuff manually until I set up something that's more dedicated to automatically crafting for the sake of it, I guess.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I've been doing a bit more landscaping on the Citadel. It's something that I've been really looking forward to, actually, in this abandoned farmstead, and that is doing an overgrown field. It's something I've not attempted yet in Minecraft. With all the foliage and all the different things that I've done around West Hill, everything is maintained. Like, the fields all have houses or farmers that would be eventually tending to them. And so I decided to go with wheat because I thought like wheat would be a good one to overgrow with like too tall grass, ferns, bushes, things like that. And so that was what I was up to this week. Was in a weird way, you kind of have to plan out the field as if it was brand new and it was functioning and well tilled and maintained, and then start to like hack at it and just say, okay, well, where am I going to leave just a couple of sprigs of wheat around to then overgrow with bushes? And we have so many blocks now with moss carpet and moss, and I use green concrete powder, sometimes azalea saplings in the ground for different textures. We've got packed mud, rooted dirt. There's mangrove wood, looks really good in the paths between the fields, like the rows between the fields, especially if you want things to look like unmaintained or they've been just left desolate. We can put grass on coarse dirt. We can, the tip we talked about last week, where we can put grass on pale moss. So I was putting pale moss in the wall, the retaining wall. So when I wanted some of this overgrowth in the fields to kind of like spill out over the wall, sure, I could use some mossy cobble and put some moss carpet down, but I would put some pale moss next to that and then plant grass on top of the pale moss. And it would really feel like the grass had been kind of pushed out over the edge of the wall. It worked out very, very well. So great tip for anybody doing some old walls, like get yourself some pale moss and work it in there when you can. It's greener than you think. It works really well next to mossy cobble and things like that. The wall blocks and a couple of other things in the area are still very much a work in progress. I've only done about half the field. I did experiment with some carrots on the lower tiers. They're okay. They're a little, I mean, the wheat texture that I have is quite bright. It's a custom texture, so it looks kind of golden, sort of like the wheat fields in Gladiator, if people have seen that film. And the carrots worked well. I tried potatoes and other flowers and stuff just to kind of see if I could work some other vegetables and colors in there. And they all kind of clashed, like they really stood out against the green, whereas the warmer kind of wheat and carrots were just a little bit more like complementary. So I'm going to go with carrots, I think, on the lower tier, just kind of spice it up a little bit. But it does look really good in my eyes with the wheat in there. It's been a lot of fun to experiment with that.
Yeah, I think the fact that you have a too high wheat texture is really great because you can combine that with too high like ferns and stuff like that. I think this is looking great. I think it's great also that you've established a style of plot farming where you've had like rows of crops and very clear paths or like dirt areas where the farmer could kind of move from crop to crop and figure that stuff out. And so having done enough of that and feeling out the style in which you build farms, it's great to then take that template and add like an overgrown farm into it. Sort of the same way that the Minecraft villages look, and then you find an abandoned village and you go, okay, this is a village where they've, added in a few broken down blocks and cobwebs and stuff like that. But with this, I think you can sort of take the similar approach to starting a regular farm and then figure out what makes it look overgrown, and it still stylistically fits in so well with everything you've done in the rest of the area. So I think it's a really smart idea to do something like this when you've got an area as developed as West Hill is.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. It's a nice I don't want to say it's a bit of a contrast, but it still feels like it fits. And putting it on the outskirts, like near the river, helps as well compared to putting it like in the middle of everything, because then it would feel kind of strange. Like, how come other farms haven't swallowed this up, right? And just kind of taken over the land. The thing with these farm plots, the way that I've done it, is the idea was to have like a 2 wide strip of farm that you could access from the path on either side. So it's like two wide crop and then a single wide path down between them. And what's good about that, and what I've realized, and I remember talking about on stream, is that you end up putting a lot more path blocks in these farm fields than you think you would. Mm-hmm. So it cuts down on the amount of crops you have to plant and do all that kind of stuff. But you in it, like when you're standing in it, you think like, this is more dirt than field. Like, this feels really weird. But when you back up and you see it from a distance as you're walking by, it still feels very full. Even this overgrown field from a distance still feels quite full. As soon as you back up far enough that you can't see every single row, or your angle is such that you can't see every single row, it really starts to feel full. And all my other fields are like that too. And again, like in it, you feel like there's just dirt everywhere. But when you're far enough away, it feels a lot not tighter, but it feels, I guess, denser than it does up close. And I like the functionality of it. Like, I like the impression of like, oh, okay, I can see where the farmers would have walked around or what the intention was here. I'm looking forward to adding those final touches of having like the textures in the wall, having the wall crumble, like having the wall not all be the same level, having some bits where pieces have been chipped away, and like adding stone buttons on the ground for pieces of the wall, and all that stuff is going to be fun to put in. So it is strange to put all this time into something that essentially, unless you walk over to it, you really can't see all this detail from walking down the main roads. So it's a little bit of the completionist in me, like just wanting to finish the valley that I set out to design. So, but it's fun to have a change of pace, because I feel like the last time I was doing landscaping, it was just a lot of green, a lot of like more natural bushes and more natural grass, and just trying to create variations. And this creates a real contrast with what will be like the riverbank, which is just going to be more of the same kind of landscaping I just mentioned. This is just going to be something that stands out and feels like, oh, there's something there. There's something there that's different that I might want to go and walk around and check out.
Yeah, well, while the natural world is evolving on the Citadel, the natural world in Minecraft itself has been evolving. Do we want to dive into the news for the week?
We will dive into the news. Not only will we dive in, we have news to talk about this early in the year, which is fantastic. So hats off to Mojang. They released Java Edition Snapshot 25W2A on Wednesday, January 8th, 2025. New features in 25W2A. New falling leaf particles to leaf blocks without particles. Cold and warm variants of the pig. Wildflowers block and leaf litter block. All blocks of leaves now have a chance to spawn falling leaf particles. This change affects oak, jungle, acacia, dark oak, spruce, mangrove, birch, azalea, and flowering azalea leaves. New pig variants have been added. The variant is determined by the biome they spawn in. The pig we are all familiar with, which is now considered a temperate pig. The pig spawns by default wherever the cold and warm pig variants do not spawn. The cold pig variants spawn in the following biomes: taiga, old growth taiga, old growth spruce taiga, and snowy taiga, as well as wind-swept hills, wind-swept gravelly hills, and wind-swept forests. The warm pig variant spawns in the following biomes: savanna, savanna plateau, wind-swept savanna, jungle, sparse jungle, and bamboo jungle, badlands, eroded badlands, and wooded badlands. When bred by a player, a baby pig variant will not be affected by the current biome, but instead randomly selected from one of the parent variants. Wildflowers are a new type of flower which grow in birch forests, old growth birch forests, and meadows. Similar to pink petals, wildflowers can have different amounts of flowers in one block space. Up to 4 wildflowers can be placed in the same block space. Placing a wildflower into an already placed wildflowers block increases the amount of flowers, and using bone meal on wildflowers will produce more wildflowers. Wildflowers can be placed in 4 orientations and can be crafted into yellow dye. Leaf litter is a new type of decorative block which can be found in forests, dark forests, and wooded badlands. Like wildflowers, pink petals Leaf litter can have different amounts of leaves in one block space. Up to 4 leaf litter pieces can be placed in the same block space. Placing leaf litter into an already placed leaf litter block increases the amount of leaves. These leaves can be placed in 4 orientations. Leaf litter can be created by smelting any type of leaves block, can be used for fuel and smelting, and has a unique block sound.
Some more changes have come along in 25W02A, including Loadstones have a new crafting recipe and can be now found in ruined portals. The crafting recipe replaces the netherite ingot with an iron ingot, so good news for anybody who wanted to make a lot of Loadstones. They've added new break, place, step, fall, and hit sounds for iron blocks, iron bars, iron trapdoors, iron doors, and heavy-weighted pressure plates. Zombified piglins now need to be killed by a player to drop player-specific loot, including experience orbs, making them consistent with all other mobs in the game. Chunks loaded by a nether portal will now be reloaded again automatically when a world is reopened. Farm animals can now spawn in Badlands to accompany the new pigs. Short grass now generates slightly more sparsely in meadows. The volume of the narrator is now affected by the game's configured volume in the voice category. Uploading a world to Realms will now enable command blocks by default, and it's now possible to upload hardcore single-player worlds to Realms as well. Bubble columns produce fewer particles and sounds now when entities that are unaffected by bubble columns are inside of them. And if the game detects that the last startup did not complete normally, the full screen option will now be reset. Garden Awakens has had some changes as well. The Pale Garden biome now occupies more space that was previously taken by Dark Forest, so you'll find slightly larger Pale Garden biomes in places where they might have generated smaller before. Woodland mansions can now also generate within a Pale Garden biome. Pale Oak leaves and Pale Oak saplings have an updated map color when seen from top down on a map. Creakings can now be named using name tags again, and named creaking will persist throughout the day. However, they will still be torn down if stuck with a player in a 2x1 space, or if they are still too far from the creaking heart. Named creakings are still resistant to all damage and can communicate with their hearts via particles. Creaking hearts correctly placed between logs have a new dormant texture during the day. Dormant creaking hearts cannot spawn new creakings and resin. They will only spawn at night, and resin will only generate at night as well. Transition between the awake and dormant states for creaking hearts and the transition of eye blossoms is now based on the fixed day time, so these behaviors are no longer affected by weather or dimension brightness. In the Loadstone changes, just to briefly recap that, the Loadstone is now crafted from 1 iron ingot surrounded by 8 chiseled stone bricks. Loadstones can now be found as loot at ruined portals in the overworld or in the nether. A few technical changes in 25W02A. The data pack version is now 62 and resource pack version is now 47. These mostly have changes to support the new pig variants, but the data pack changes include updates to the data format of text components and some changes to structure blocks. If you're interested in the technical side of things, we recommend checking out the full changelog at minecraft.net for more information. Some notable bug fixes in 25W2A. Tridents or arrows shot through lava sometimes not catching fire. That's an old bug that's been fixed, along with the aforementioned zombified piglins dropping XP and rare drops if killed by anything while they're in their angered state. They've also fixed a couple of things related to elytra, including not being able to hang on to climbable blocks while gliding with elytra, players no longer being able to activate swimming mode in water while flying with elytra as of the most recent release version, and bubble columns now have the opposite effect on tridents and wind charges than they had before, so that's a bug that's been fixed as well. Many more bug fixes can be found in the changelog at minecraft.net. We'll also have that linked for you in our show notes for this week over at thespawnchunks.com.
Our main discussion this week is going to be about the new block types and some of the new features, but some of the bug fixes and changes we can talk about here in the news discussion. The first thing that stands out to me is the zombie piglin aggro, which is going to affect the Citadel because we still use a donut farm in the nether for repairing and for gathering XP. For the only reason in that it's closer than the end, and I think it's faster than our current Enderman farm. So
Right, yeah.
We're going to have to do some retrofitting on that. I don't think it's going to be a big deal. Like, I think I can just change the chamber to allow me to do some manual killing and still get XP. I may even be able to adjust the chamber to do both, because it's the design is that there are 4 cardinal directions which the piglins could come in and get you, but the rates were never so big that it worked that well. So I've removed access to 3 of the 4 chambers, and they all pile into one. So I think it would be easy to have one chamber focused on manual killing, another chamber focused on, like, if you just wanted gold collection, you just wanted to sit there and AFK, they could still die the old-fashioned way. You won't get the XP, but you'll get the gold. And you could just choose which side you want the piglins to go in via some sort of switch inside, or just flipping a trapdoor. And that way, the farm could still be viable and not be just like an old relic that we have to, pass over. So I'm looking forward to messing around with that, because I do like, retrofitting older farms to bring them up to speed. It's not my favorite change, but it does make sense in terms of like making sure it's in line with the way that the rest of the game works.
Yeah, definitely. Like, we sort of foresaw this coming. We talked about it briefly last week in terms of what we expected to happen in 2025. I don't see this currently making waves in the community like it did back in the Nether update when they were considering fixing this bug long term. In the intervening time, most players seem to have switched to gold farm designs that kill the piglins either passively for no XP and drops, or require an active player kill anyway. So you mostly see people adapting their farm designs over the last few years to basically anticipate this change. So anybody who is still working with one of those farm designs like you are, I think it's going to be an easy enough fix to change that. And like you said, if they're already filtering into one area, that's just a matter of making that area safe for a player to walk up and swing a sword a few times. There are already a lot of people switching their designs to something that just has the piglins drop gold nuggets, purely because then you don't have to deal with gold swords and the sorting of it and filtering out rotten flesh and just disposing of that however you prefer to is a lot easier that way. Plus now you've got an easy way to auto craft all of those nuggets into gold blocks anyway, so it's all just about how much AFK time you have if gold is what you want out of the farm. So yeah, I agree. I think it's high time changes like this got made if they were going to make them at all. And I'm fairly happy that it's happening in a minor update at this point, so it's not imperative that people switch to this update right away if they still want a little bit of time with the old designs, but I think it makes sense that the new designs are going to be taking over at this stage anyway. My initial thoughts on this were, wow, that was quick. I genuinely didn't expect a feature snapshot so soon into 2025. And the other things that stuck out, aside from the changes we're going to be talking about in the main discussion this week, is the Loadstone changes. I'm pleasantly surprised by this. I think Loadstones in general are a cool functional block and quite a nice detailed, like, decorative block. And you didn't see people using them enough, the primary reason being you had to sacrifice an entire netherite ingot every time you wanted one. And so I think it's good to see them made cheaper. I think the only backlash I've seen against this is from players who have just recently spent a lot of netherite ingots on crafting lodestones and thought, well, I have to deal with the expense if I want to use a block that's that detailed. But I think it's going to be nice to see people exploring the possibilities of them, and I'm curious if Mojang has any future plans for lodestones being able to do more, considering that they've just made this recipe cheaper, whether it's purely because they want players to have better access to them, or if it's because they have something else in mind for lodestones that it's going to benefit the player to have easier access to them when they implement a new feature. But that's sort of far future speculation at this point. I don't have anything else to back that up, just a small hunch, I guess.
I'm looking forward to using them around Westhill, because the number one reason that I have not is I get the cost. I barely even have, I don't even have full netherite armor. I've got boots. And that's it. I've got full netherite tools, but boots are the only other thing that I wear. And it's really because I find gathering of netherite to be a giant pain. And so I just decided that, well, as nice as it looks, if I can get one, maybe I'll put it in a very key location. But now that they're cheaper, I'm really kind of glad I waited, because I can see these being something to help differentiate the stone church in the east of Westhill, the keep, which is a big special building. There's a couple of fancier houses like the mansion on the west side of the town. So there's a couple of key locations that I think I could use a lodestone to help make things stand out. Main gates would be good too. So I'm looking forward to messing around with it more. And I've not really done anything with the mechanics either, again, because it's just so expensive, and I haven't really done anything where that would necessarily be a thing to do, but it could be interesting to introduce either server mates or guests on the server to take a spin through West Hill to use the Loadstone to maybe guide them around a little bit. Like, oh, hey, you've arrived through the portal, but like you have to head south. And if you don't know that, then having a compass kind of point you there could be kind of fun.
It goes in line with one of the other things we had suggested about uses for the bundle as well, is that if you have 12 lodestones all attached to different compasses in a bundle, you can carry them all in a single inventory slot, but any of those compasses will, at whatever time you look at the bundle, point to various locations around your world. So you can always know what direction it is to your stronghold, your various farms in the overworld, that kind of thing. And not to mention, lodestones also work in the Nether and the End, where other forms of navigation have a harder time. The compasses will spin wildly, the maps won't work in the Nether, that kind of thing. So I think it's kind of neat for players to be able to explore other options like that. You can imagine basically having the Nether hub in your pocket if you know which way people's bases are on a server, purely based on the fact that you've got a bundle with a bunch of compasses in it. So that could be a really neat way of navigating. Other stuff to talk about from this, the Pale Garden changes I think are really good. The biome being larger, the day-night effect elements no longer being unpredictable in different weather conditions, which was something I noticed just through anecdotal exploration of it in the snapshots, was like a thunderstorm starts and suddenly you've got to worry about mobs and creaking, and it changes the time of day that you can expect stuff to happen, confuses the plants, that kind of thing. And so that's probably good for making them more consistent, especially for redstone applications that rely on them activating at different times of day. And then creaking being name tagged to make them persistent during the day is great news for anybody who wanted to use them for technical purposes or for minigames. Like, you imagine that folks like Tango thinking about, like, am I going to do Decked Out 3? Can I incorporate new mobs into that? Thinking, oh, cool, a mob that attacks you when you're not looking at it? Great way to introduce more jeopardy into this game. And then hearing that it was only going to be active during the night when most players on a server are going to be sleeping during the night to make sure it's daytime, that feels like it's kind of pulled the rug out from under you. But being able to name tag them, especially in an environment where they can't be attacked and the only risk to them staying persistent is them being forced out of the area of their creaking heart. That's something else to point out, is that creaking don't naturally walk beyond the boundary that the creaking heart allows them. It's just if you like break a block under them and they can drop a certain amount or something, or you push them out with pistons or water streams take them too far away. So if you can create conditions under which you're certain that creaking isn't going to despawn, name tagging it remains worth it, and you can use them for minigames, you can use them for eye trackers to detect which direction a player is looking. There's so much fun stuff you can do with them now that we have the capability of doing that. So I think really great job on Mojang's part to listen to player feedback on that and make them, like, find a compromise that works for both camps of players.
I think that it's a good compromise, and it's a good consistent behavior within the game too, with what happens with name tags and what you expect from a mob after you name tag it.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I've actually thought about using creaking as an eye direction detector. That's really cool. And to have that, it's almost like having it reminds me of like the Flintstone contraptions from the cartoon, where you'd have like a pelican in the record player that would like be the needle for the record, and having a creaking as part of your circuit to detect which direction eyeballs are going. It's like having a hamster in a maze, just stepping on a pressure plate when it gets close enough to the player that's facing the right direction, and then something happens in the background. Like there's some really, really interesting things. Like you could use, like, imagine having something look like it's going to scan your eyeball, like an eye scan entry security door, but what you're doing is bringing a creaking closer to you, and it just kind of like steps on the right pressure plate and then opens the door. Like that's pretty slick.
And the cool thing about that is that the comparators measure like the creaking heart to determine how far a creaking is away from a creaking heart. So you don't even need it to interact with a pressure plate. Like you can do that stuff really precisely just by having multiple creakings spawn and having them sneak up on the player to different distances. And if they're limited in how far away they go, that generates a certain amount of redstone signal from their respective creaking hearts. You can do tons with it as long as you have access to it throughout the day, and you can contain the creaking. I think that's the main thing, is that even if you're relying on them naturally spawning, you have to be concerned with where they can spawn. But if you've got a creaking that's definitely attached to that creaking heart, the heart isn't going to spawn anymore. So if you've name tagged one, then you can guarantee that that one's not going to pop up somewhere you don't expect it to, right? And so I think that's going to be really helpful for people who want to use that for like precision uses. It's just going to make everything a lot more reliable, which is great. I also wanted to bring up the elytra bug fixes, because I think I've lost count of how many times I activate my elytra on a ladder and then I just slide right down. And so I think it's really good that they fixed that. I've also noticed since 121.4 that swimming, if you fly into water with elytra, you just don't swim around as fast after that. It requires you to touch down on a solid block and then start swimming, which, like, I know we've talked about swimming and elytra and the kind of awkward interactions on the surface especially, but in my case, I was going to grab some more ink because I needed black dye, and I was diving down for squid and then realizing that I was moving at a snail's pace even though I have depth strider and should be moving a lot faster. And it's because you couldn't activate swimming and elytra at the same time, but they seem to have resolved that now, so a lot happier with that change.
Yeah, my trick when I need a bucket of water is a bit of a mobility show-off thing on stream, is to fly into a deep enough lake or river, grab the bucket of water, and then just point up and hit a rocket again. And because you haven't touched the ground, you're still basically in flight mode, and so you shoot out of the water like Iron Man. And I mean, it's a fun trick to do. But I would happily sacrifice that if this change means that goes away. Also means that I don't skip around like a rock on the top of the surface of the water when I'm trying to like decorate something, or you're doing some landscaping where you're only in like 1 to 2 blocks of water. But the moment you enter swim mode and then try to get out of the water, you end up in this weird kind of like elytra skipping surface thing. And if that is fixed, I am a happy camper, because it's something that's really frustrating, to the point where like I used to take my elytra off while I was doing like riverscape landscape stuff because it just got so annoying. Yeah,
there's a couple of other things that I wonder could be on the docket in future for elytra. One of the bug fixes in this snapshot has removed players' ability to walk faster diagonally. There's something about the way your X and Z position are calculated, which has apparently annoyed a few folks who are really keen on so-called movement tech and the ability to like move around faster and exploit like certain things about that. And I'm wondering if, as a compromise in that department, they might bring back something else that went away in 1.21.4, which was that elytra kind of glide hopping. The way if you kept sort of tapping the spacebar rhythmically as you were sprint jumping with elytra, you could kind of bunny hop and you'd start to gain a lot more momentum. That's now been nullified as of 1.21.4 because your momentum with elytra resets once you hit the ground instantly. And so everyone who is used to moving around like that has found it a bit jarring to get back to that style of movement, and so I'm wondering if maybe they're going to try and reintroduce that after a bit of feedback from players, but we'll see if that's something that gets codified permanently or something that is considered a bug and is eliminated for good.
It might be a bit of an old man comment, but what's the obsession with the absolute max speed at which you move forward through the game on the ground by jumping in video games in general? I find that any game that says like, oh yeah, you get like a 0.2 distance over time increase if you're jumping constantly while you're running along the ground, immediately ends up in the entire community of that game, or most of them, constantly jumping while you're moving around. And it drives me nuts. And that could be just because I'm watching content creators and I'm not the one that's actually doing the jumping. But I, on purpose, walk around on the ground, or I'll fly. I mean, I don't mind flying 30 blocks. Like, I will absolutely take off with my elytra to go back to my shulker island and get something that I just forgot rather than walking back. But I won't do like the run, jump, hop thing. I'm not sure what it is about it that I don't get it, because to me it's a trade-off in a visual jarring behavior for a teeny tiny little increase in speed. Like, it's not like you do twice as fast. It's like it's a small percentage of increase, but there seems to be this obsession with like the most efficient way to walk around. And in Minecraft, I don't know that that's the game where I feel like I need to, like, unless I can see it if maybe you're speed running or something, but I'm talking about just the average player, right?
Yeah, I think it's something I do habitually at this point, and I think maybe it comes from wanting to run around on servers and other people doing it, and so keeping up with people or gaining on somebody who's running away from you at a certain speed. It can help just to like catch up a little bit. And so, you know, you see somebody running, sprinting and jumping, and you do the same thing in order to catch up to them. I think it really depends on your mindset, though. In a game like Minecraft that has virtually infinite space, do you just want to get to your destination faster? Or is your mindset more like, well, there's infinite space in this game, so I'm not going to rush anything, you know? Like, it's really about, like, it's about the way you build your base as well, like how much space you want between things and how difficult it is for you to cross that space, and how interacting with other things that can help you cross that space faster is often a little bit more fiddly, requires more, mouse input and finer control than just hammering space or holding down the space bar as you hop across the plains. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to hear from anybody who, like, wants to more optimize the movement in their game and see if, like, some of these changes have affected them as well, because I think it really is. It's a bit of the speedrunner mindset. It's the playing correctly or playing optimally mindset that occurs to so many players in Minecraft when they want to, optimize redstone contraptions and time spent in game and resources generated per time spent and that kind of thing. I think all of those mindsets exist as subcultures within Minecraft, and changes like this aren't going to affect everybody, but maybe there are subconscious behaviors that some players are doing related to some of these changes without even knowing it.
And it's funny how it snowballs, because like the example that you gave about keeping up with a server mate, like if you both just walked or ran without the jumping, you'd both move at the same speed.
Yeah.
Like if they jump and get ahead of you, you then have to jump and catch up. But like if you're doing something together, if you just both decide to walk at the same speed, then problem solved. But it's like, but if that's not discussed, if the other person is like you, has that habit, then you have to adopt that habit to keep up without any real like conscious decision to do so. It's just like it just happens. I find that phenomenon really interesting.
I think it's interesting because it doesn't always feel natural for both of you to run at the same pace. Because if you're, like, let's say they take off a couple of seconds before you, you're a couple of seconds behind them, you keep the exact same distance between yourselves. And especially when you're trying to have a conversation with somebody through Discord or whatever, in-game voice chat, you want to be walking alongside them because that's what you do in real life when you want to have a conversation with somebody. And so you'll like run and skip ahead a little bit to catch up, and sometimes they'll want to move ahead of you, and it sort of mimics how people move in real life, where people aren't walking in lockstep constantly. Even when I'm out walking with my partner, I feel like, one of us will go ahead or the other one will sort of step aside, or will like decide to cross the street a little bit earlier, and then the other person will like, follow suit and catch up behind. And then we try and match our walking pace later, but because we have different strides, because we're different sizes, like we find ourselves adjusting pace constantly. And I think that's maybe what people are emulating in Minecraft on a subconscious level. But this is getting way too much into like the human psychology of controlling this video game. So maybe that's a conversation for another time, perhaps with an expert. Maybe we can find somebody who's into like movement in video games and can maybe clarify some of that stuff for us.
In the meantime, we can talk about some chunk mail. If you would like to email the show, the email address is spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. Please keep your emails short and to the point. It does help us include them in the episode. Once again, that email address is spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. And Jonny has this week's email.
This one comes in from Rodomify with the subject of more warm and cold animal variations. Hello, Joel and Pix. In the new Snapshots 25W02A, Mojang released new variants of pigs, and with it, new tags that imply they will add more variants for other farm mobs. Frogs already have warm and cold versions, and recently Mojang added different dog types. What other mobs do you think they could update to have more aesthetic variants? Rodomify has made the advancement variants of mob kind. That's a fun twist on the email sign-off. We usually get death messages. This time we get other chat messages, which are advancements. I like that.
Yeah, I like the idea of not only coming up with a new advancement, but coming up with like whatever kind of twisty or punny name it might be called is also really fun. When I was thinking about this, and obviously talking about farm animals, the first thing that came to my mind was cows. I think that that would be an easy one to add. I know that something like a Highland cow added to the game would definitely get points with the cute, cozy members of the Minecraft community. And I think that would be a great way to kind of differentiate some cows and have some variety. Because when you start to have like a fenced-in farm of cows, it does start to feel very samey. They don't really have much to tell them apart, especially if you're trying to do a little bit of RP or use them for different things. I would like them to revisit the cow model if they did that too. And I think you'll see that theme in a lot of my comments, is that when they do the retextures on things, I think there's an opportunity to revisit the model a little bit. I'm not saying making sweeping changes. I think it still has to have that slightly odd Minecraft vibe, and I do get that. But I think that cows would be a really easy hit. Chickens would be really interesting because right now they look like ducks, and it's only the noise that really indicates to you that it's a chicken. And so I don't know what you do in that case. Where do you make more chicken duck variants, or do you actually take the time to make a chicken and then end up with also adding a duck? Like, is that an opportunity to split the chicken duck into two different mobs? And is that necessary? Does that affect a lot of the marketing? We've talked about this before, where some of these mobs are so iconic that they're in like plushies and t-shirts and logos, and like if you change them at all, then does that affect existing branding and stuff like that? But I think that chicken variants would be cool. And you could also have it be something that affects gameplay. Adding a rooster, version of the chicken could mean that approaching chicken breeding would be very different. Right now, they breed like Jurassic Park dinosaurs. And so having a rooster would be, have a bit of education there. It could be from an RP stand of view, like having a rooster crow, like in Stardew Valley, at the start of the day is an interesting idea. You'd have to decide whether you want that or not. And I guess the idea would be just like keep it far enough away that you can't hear it if you don't like it, if you want to have one. But like that could be an interesting way to go down that road. And then I started thinking about like what other non-player passive mobs there could be variants of. And the first thing that I thought of was spiders. Having spiders in different biomes, giving them different colors or even different sizes doesn't have to change the model. Again, an opportunity to update the model. But it's one of those things that's very iconic in terms of the experience of the game. But also there's a lot of fantasy in spiders because they are massive. They are very much like Hobbit level spiders. And I think you could lean into the fantasy, and rather than just going with, a different color based on the biome, like a green jungle spider or a gray desert tarantula, you could go with like an ice spider, or a lava spider, something that has a little bit more fantasy element to it, looks more like a baddie from a video game than necessarily something you would find naturally in the world. And I think that could be a fun way to mess around with spiders. What do you think about a different mob variants and how it could be implemented in the game?
I think you've already touched on the ones that would immediately spring to mind for me as well. Like cows are the obvious candidate. There's not a great deal of variety to them. Regarding the chicken model, I'm curious whether at this point the chicken is one of those things like the creeper where they sort of can't change it because it's iconic and has a lot of merchandise and it's appeared in so many animations and that kind of thing that it feels like if there was ever a time to update it, it was much earlier in the game's lifespan. But who knows? They've made some pretty big swings lately. I wouldn't put it past them. And the notion that there could be ducks all of a sudden, and the chickens had basically been masquerading as chickens the entire time, and they were actually all ducks, is pretty funny. So I like that idea. I do think Highland cows get my vote personally. I'm absolutely on board with that. One thing I'm fairly certain they wouldn't go this direction with is sheep, because the majority of a sheep's texture is the wool color, and the only thing they could really change would be the face and the feet at that point. And so I don't see sheep changing to have warm and cold variants. I feel like that's also, I think, fairly typical of real life. There might be like slightly woollier sheep in slightly colder conditions, but sheep are pretty much the same everywhere in the world, whereas animals like pigs have a variety of shapes, sizes, colorings. Like I think pigs were a really great candidate for this. And so cows, because there's a variety of breeds, there's a variety of locations you find them, and they can feel quite different from place to place, they make a pretty obvious example. I think all of the other mobs, a lot of them have variants anyway. Like you think about the coloring of horses, it's not tied to a specific biome, but there are enough of them to make them feel different even if you find them in the same places. I'm wondering if maybe something a little off the wall here, like squid, for example. You could find squid in warmer oceans with different coloration to, like, say, they keep the current black squid that you get in like colder oceans, in like frozen oceans and normal temperate oceans, but then in tropical oceans, maybe you end up with more of a like pinky, corally kind of color squid to balance that out, because we know that giant squid come in like a variety of different colors. in real life. There's a few other things here and there. I do think the hostile mob idea is a fun one, and that's already kind of occupied by things like husks and drowned and the differences that occur in strays, obviously, for skeletons in colder biomes. And so I'm not certain if they want to go down the line and have, like, a cold spider and a cold witch and things like that. But there's certainly some opportunity for them to introduce some variation there. Maybe instead of a fire resistance potion, the cold witch could have a potion that helps you resist powder snow, and like they have a potion of antifreeze or something that they carry around with them instead, right? I think maybe there's possibilities for stuff like that introduce. My main priority really is if it introduces gameplay variation as well as just aesthetic variation. That's the main piece of feedback I have when we move on to this discussion about the pigs. Is it's aesthetics and it's lovely, but does it mean new gameplay? Does it mean that those are worth seeking out for anything other than just a collect them all kind of perspective on gameplay, or is there still something left to be desired from making these mobs aesthetic variations just for the sake of it?
Speaking of that discussion, I mean, we can move on to this week's main chat, which is going to be about new year and new features. And to remind folks, the new features that are announced in 25W02A are falling leaf particles from all leaf blocks, new pig variants with warm and cold pigs, and of course wildflowers and leaf litter. And since we're talking about mobs, we might as well start with the pigs. What were your first impressions of the new pig textures?
I mean, I think they're perfectly fine. Like, I think the textures are nice. The cold pigs seem to be based on Mangalitsa pigs, which are a Hungarian breed of pig I was reading, which have like a natural woolly coat, and they're some of the only woolly pigs that exist in the world. The warm pigs seem closer to something like an African breed. I was looking up red river hogs and bush pigs, and they have that kind of warm brown with a stripe across the back. That's kind of a similar aesthetic to the pigs. I just wish they did more. is the main thing. Like, they provide decent food. Pork chops are basically the same as steak, but people don't tend to farm pigs unless they haven't found any cows, because cows also provide leather, and that's just beneficial to a player from a long-term perspective, and they just think, sure, I'll get steak. I think, honestly, steak has a better PR in the real world as well than pork chops do, so I feel like a lot of the time people are going to go after steak just because they recognize it as a foodstuff, whereas they don't necessarily have pork chops a whole bunch. And I think if pigs did more than just provide a decent food source and a sort of jokey, at this point, legacy mount, I think with this amount of care and attention by the art team, I would hope that the gameplay team would have ideas to make them more unique. In the past, I've heard ideas like having them dig up truffles or mushrooms or roots, or producing a larger litter of babies after breeding. So, even though they're still alternative to cows in terms of the food providing the same amount, you end up with a larger herd of pigs faster than you would a herd of cows. Because that's, I guess, fairly common in pig breeding in the real world. So maybe that's a direction that they could go with it, or maybe they just want to keep things aesthetic. But I think the new pigs are nice. I just don't see the point to them from a gameplay perspective, if there's ever going to be a point to them from a gameplay perspective.
I fell in the same camp. I thought they looked okay. The woolly variant was cool to see, but it's really subtle. Like, I really only noticed some of the bottom textures of the fur hanging off the pig, watching some videos of people like reviewing the Snapshot. So it's not something that I picked up on right away. Obviously the color changes are something that makes sense, and I think help the pigs feel more in the environments that they're spawning in. The woolly one is less saturated and looks more appropriate in a taiga, and the same thing with the warmer brown rather than like the weird pale pink pig in like a Badlands biome. The brown looks a little bit more at home, in the same way that an animal is, unless there's a purpose to being brightly colored, they're usually a little bit more camouflage, especially if they're a prey animal, which a pig would fall under. And I was thinking too, like, there could have been an opportunity here to put in like a wild boar or something, but I guess they kind of have that with the hoglin, and they maybe not want to have pigs mistaken for something aggressive, which could be confusing for new players. Again, returning to the opportunity to update the model, I'm not saying you have to change the world or make it a huge difference, but like, a bouncy tail or floppy ears. The penguin's got floppy ears. Like having pigs with floppy ears would make sense, or even just having ears in general, like something stick off the side of the box. I think would be a very simple, very fun way to update the model. I didn't notice any difference in animation. And I think that's one of the other things that sets aside new mobs like armadillos, frogs, and the like, is that they are animated better. And the fact that these pigs and cows walk around on boxes, and you can animate them so that they look a little bit better. When you're updating the textures, like it's a good opportunity to just revisit the animation, make it look a little bit more modern. And I think that that's something that would help tie all the mobs together so that they all feel like they sort of match the same world rather than old mobs versus new mobs. Also just makes Minecraft feel like it's up with the times, and it's a subtle change. Like it doesn't really affect gameplay, just, an update to the animation. But I agree. I think pigs could be used for more things. I was thinking along the in terms of texture, like if we got pigs that were able to like bury themselves in mud, if you put mud around and then become a muddy version of the pig. Yes, I know it would add a texture to the now 3 different versions of pigs, but if there was something gameplay related, like by burying themselves in the mud, maybe that mud block changes. So similar to getting rooted dirt underneath an azalea tree, if you create a mud hole for a pig, eventually those mud blocks will turn into something, or maybe the grass blocks around that will turn into something. And then you could harvest them, replace the grass blocks, and get like a new building block out of it. Maybe like it's a lighter mud block or a brown block that we don't have texture of, something in between, coarse dirt and terracotta. I don't know. Something like that could be really fun, because it's not going to be a giant farm. It's not going to be something that's going to be pumping out a lot of stuff, but at least it gives an opportunity for players to interact with a pig with some sort of motivation behind it, right?
Yeah. Like, I'm honestly, with the mud thing, I'm quite surprised that one of the textures we got wasn't the muddy pig that they introduced for Minecraft Earth, because that was slightly different. That was before mud was introduced as a block to the game, and mud was a liquid. It was something you moved around with buckets, similar to water. And so obviously the mechanics of interacting with that were different, but that was a unique thing to Minecraft Earth. And I'm quite surprised, given how beloved that was at the time. It was sort of everyone's darling, like, addition to Minecraft Earth. They kind of went into they went the whole hog, if you will, in promoting it. Nice. I get the feeling that maybe they've gone the half hog this time around and not included it for various reasons. I think maybe just so it doesn't feel like they're repeating ideas too much, but it felt like the muddy pig was a pretty easy line to draw. While we're thinking about like alternatives to other cows and stuff as well, like this could be a really interesting opportunity for them to reintroduce the moo bloom, thinking of stuff that kind of came over from Minecraft Earth as an idea, right? So yeah, like I think there's more that they can do with pigs. I would be surprised if it stops here, but then in terms of animation, in terms of gameplay, it depends the workload that puts on people who might just be dedicated to producing upcoming new features for a major feature update, as opposed to one of these smaller gameplay drop kind of ideas. The other stuff they've worked on this time around, from an aesthetic point of view, and this seems very like ambient, like exploring the real world, exploring the world of Minecraft, and getting kind of a similar sense of immersion. Leaf particles are a new thing that's in this one. We've obviously seen leaf particles from cherry trees, sort of related the particles from spore blossoms in lush caves, but then pale oak leaves drop particles from pale oak trees as well. And I think adding leaf particles to all of the other leaves feels like they're kind of throwing everything at it all at once. But it's an experiment that seems to have worked quite well. Players responded really well to particles from the other leaf blocks. And the new ones, having explored in the snapshot a little bit, do add a really nice ambience to forests and even to isolated trees. I think they've done a good job of balancing the particles. They're noticeable, but they're not overwhelming. And it doesn't feel like you're just being rained on constantly whenever you're under the boughs of a tree. Like it feels a bit more sparse than that, in a way that I think feels a lot more natural. The only piece of pushback I've seen about this idea, and it's something that I agree with, I think, on principle, but I'm not certain it's a change I need them to make, is that spruce leaves drop leaf-shaped particles when spruce are supposed to be coniferous trees, which would have needles rather than leaves. Whenever they're in the taiga biome where you have podzol, that's what podzol is. It's like the coating of needles and stuff that haven't been able to decay in the same way that a covering of leaves would do in a forest. I suppose this also raises the side question of why the block is called spruce leaves, but I suppose that's more of a general Minecraft category thing. So yeah, like if anything, I feel like they could remove the leaf particles from spruce trees to differentiate them more and be more accurate to their real world biology, but I don't know if they need to do that. I think honestly it's fine if they just want to have them produce particles across the board, then I'm personally okay with it.
I like the idea of removing the spruce leaves falling from spruce leaves in the game. I think that they're, again, Minecraft education and just the idea of having it be a little bit more realistic is fine. I also think that it wouldn't be a big hit for people that use leaves for decoration, because spruce leaves is not high on that list of blocks that people are using for decoration.
Mm-hmm.
And I can speak to this at length because I have a mod on the Citadel called Falling Leaves, and it does exactly this. It puts falling leaves underneath all the leaves that you want. I believe in the settings there is a toggle for spruce. So yes or no, do you want them to come from spruce? There is a toggle for the size of the leaf, the frequency at which they fall, whether or not they fall from player-placed blocks, and what is the minimum height that they will fall from. So if you have like a bunch of too tall trees around and you just find it's annoying that there's lots of leaves in your face, you can say, no, the leaf block has to be at least 4 blocks above the ground before these leaves start to fall. And that would, of course, reduce the number of leaves happening. So it's both a performance thing, but also like an ambiance thing. Like if you're in a forest and there's just leaves everywhere, then you can say, okay, well, let's not have them fall from everything. Let's have them only fall from things that are so high off the ground. That also really helps if you're doing vines and things around by decorating. I've decided to let leaves fall from player-placed blocks because I do a lot of custom trees. But in the process of doing that, some of my vines that crawl up my my walls will have leaves falling from them. And so I just increased, I think, the minimum to like 3 or 4 blocks. And so the leaves fall, but they don't look like they're falling from something that's a meter off the ground. They look like they're falling from something like roof height or higher, which is kind of like where I gauged it, because most of my walls for ground level houses are about 4 blocks tall. And so I found that worked out really well. I would imagine at some point in the development process for this, we will see some sort of setting. If nothing else, there'll be an on-off in the Minecraft settings for performance and or accessibility. If it's just a lot for people to look at, or if it's too hard for older systems or whatever, then they might want to have like an on-off switch. I hope they give us a little bit more control. I wouldn't mind seeing even just leaving the spruce thing up to the players. Like, do you want deciduous trees and coniferous trees to be different? Yes or no? You just flip the switch in the settings and go off and do your thing. But I do like them. I think that something that I really like about the experience that I've had with this mod on the Citadel is just how much life and movement it adds to your experience walking around. Just the odd tree next to my paths having a single leaf fall from it as I walk by. Just chef's kiss. Like, it really adds a lot of motion and ambiance to a very static world, which is very still otherwise,
Yeah, and I think the thing that's really complemented that with this Snapshot release is leaf litter, which surprised me as an addition. Like, I think Wildflowers are an easy win. I think it's a great color. I think those are, they're just pink petals with a slightly different reskin, and having both of them in the game, we've talked before about sub-block details being great. I think those I don't have as much to say about because they just diversify the range of color flowers we can have beyond pink petals. Leaf litter was a surprise to me. I think mainly just because of the color at first and the sheer amount of it. It was like having had the particles, suddenly all of these leaves had been raining down from these trees for years, and the entire forest of the sort of starting biome that I found in this fresh Snapshot world was just, the floor was covered with this leaf litter. I was expecting it to be more green at first, like the leaves had just fallen as opposed to being there for a while, and so suddenly the contrast of the green to how brown all of the leaf litter texture is took me by surprise. And then the sheer scale of it. I think I can see this being dialed back a little bit in terms of how much of it generates in future, because while I think it looks good, having spent some time with it and getting used to it, I think it's a good addition to the game. It has strangled out a lot of the natural grass and flower generation that helps the biome feel a bit more diverse. You especially find this in dark oak forests, and there's a lot of green area underneath those trees where you typically find patches of grass and flowers and stuff going on, and now it's almost all leaf litter. And I think maybe a balance of the two would be better, especially since initially I thought this wasn't a block that you could reproduce. So I thought, oh, you can just, you're getting a lot of it in the world because you can't craft it in any way. And then people in chat informed me that on the changelog it says you can smelt leaf blocks in a furnace, and if they are the smelted item as opposed to the fuel, you get leaf litter in the output slot. And so you can effectively farm trees, break all the leaves, smelt the leaves into leaf litter, and have as much of these to play with as you want to, which should be a fairly easy pipeline for crafting them yourself. So I don't know if it needs to be that proliferation of leaf litter needs to be quite so dense in natural generation. I think they could probably dial that back a little bit. But I think the fact that we have a block that's like pink petals and wildflowers that can be placed in a diverse range of ways, having the sort of quarter of a block placement of it, does what pink petals did to begin with, which is provide a really nice, diverse range of decoration options. So I think on balance, I like them, but they were a little bit to get used to. How do you feel about leaf litter so far?
My first impression was, no, sir, I don't like it. And it was from the natural spawning. The more I looked into it, I was like, okay, I can start to see more of the potential here. And it was the sheer amount of them in the forests when I was seeing, online. And I think what's true to a real life forest there is that there is a lot of that on the ground, and the grounds in a forest are brown, but there's a lot of 6-inch to 2-foot tall greenery at the bed of a forest that is very green, and then makes the forest looks more like a mix. And with Minecraft, your grass texture and your leaf litter texture are both the same level, unless you start to allow, as you said, flowers, grass, too tall grass, ferns to start propping up along with the leaf litter. And I think that combo is kind of like, they have to figure out what the secret sauce is for the balance there. And after that, I think it'll start to look good in its natural environment. I really like some of the things that I've seen. We'll have a link to a Diamond MC 1234 on Reddit that shared some gradients going from from coarse dirt to grass using leaf litter, and from coarse dirt to mud using leaf litter and mangrove, muddy mangrove roots in between. And they are convincing gradients. Like, it looks pretty smooth. The kind of thing that you would see in like a pixel art indie game, going from one kind of biome to another. Really, really interesting stuff. And any time that we have an opportunity to use one of these sub-block blocks, they call them blocks. I think they're still classified as blocks, but you get off the grid. Like, depending on which way you're facing, as you rotate around the different directions as you're placing these things, you can get off the grid. And it's a wonderful way to have flower beds or roads or grass or something just kind of dither into the other parts of your world. Gives you a lot more control. And you don't want to do it everywhere, but in places where you want to break that grid and have it be poignant, it's really helpful. I really liked combining allium, flowering azalea, and pink petals. And the pink petals were like the closest thing to you and the ground, closest to the path, but it allowed me to kind of give that garden, even if it was tiny, not a straight edge. Like, it would look like an L or a plus sign if I just had regular blocks. But now that I've got these pink petals, I can give it a softer edge, and it feels much more natural. So I'm sure leaf litter is going to have all kinds of uses for framing paths, doing gradients. Obviously, it's only going to be on flat surface, like we can't put them on walls or anything. But there's a lot of potential there for some expression and I will say immersion, in terms of bringing players that see your builds kind of like into what you want to portray.
Yeah. I think the thing that's throwing a lot of people right now is the inability to put them in piles. I think previous like mods or like people sort of mocked up concepts of having loose leaves in the game was to be able to pile them up as though they've all been swept into a large pile, the kind of thing you know have in your front yard after you've been raking the leaves. And I think a lot of people they hear about leaf litter and they're surprised it's not something you can stack up like snow layers. Here is one of the reasons I think we don't get something like that, and it's transparency. I can't imagine there being an easy way for the art team to solve the problem of being able to layer things up with 1/8 of a block appearing with each fresh layer and keep transparency, but still keep it looking like the textures wrap around the side of the block properly. Like, the reason snow layers work the way they do is because they're a solid texture. And I think having something like that done with transparency still as part of it and something that builds up like a full leaf block would be a little more difficult. Besides which, I think it's nicer to have something which looks different from the top down than it does from the side. I feel like a lot of the time we don't give enough credence to how much we're viewing blocks from the top down as we walk around. And so while the range of height that you could get out of something like snow layers if you applied it to leaves is nice, I think you get so much more diversity from having something that takes up 1/4 of a block versus the full block space like a carpet. And so I think that's honestly the strength of leaf litter. Even though it's not the implementation people were expecting, I think it works really well for decorative stuff. That said, I have 2 main pieces of feedback about leaf litter. The 2 things that I'm sort of surprised that it doesn't do. First of all, I think it should be placeable on any solid block. Right now, it follows the same rules as Wildflowers and Pink Petals do, where those have to be attached to grass or a dirt variant. Moss is included, so you can get it onto pale moss as well if you want to, but you can't place leaf litter on stone, which makes sense when it's a plant that has to be supported by the block below it. Because, you know, even with pink petals, you think of them as something that's fallen from the cherry trees, but if you look, they have stems, and so they're effectively like small flowers that are sprouting from the block below. Leaf litter is categorically dead. Like, it's leaves that have fallen from trees and are just strewn around, which you'd theorize means they could be strewn around anywhere because they're no longer supported in life by the block below them. And so putting them on stone so that you can have them littering pathways and that kind of thing feels natural. I think you should be able to place them on any solid block. In addition to that, you could have them on top of things like pumpkins or melons or whatever, introduce a bit of biodiverse feeling to whatever melon or pumpkin patch you've got growing, something a lot more autumnal as well around pumpkins. I think it'll work really well given the colors that they already have. I think either give us that or allow them to be biome tinted so they fit in with the nature of the biome around them a little bit better. So have them be darker in spruce biomes if they generate there, or, you know, in this case, I think they're only in forests and dark oak, but you could obviously move them to other biomes. So you could find that they are slightly darker and maybe greener in a dark oak forest versus something maybe a little bit more pale if they get into the regular temperate forest with oak and birch around. I think either or in that case. I think make them placeable on solid blocks would be my preference, but I think biome tint could appease some of the people who think they contrast quite heavily with the biome right now. The other thing is that I think they should be compostable, which they're not right now. Wildflowers are, leaf litter is not, and all my garden clippings and raked leaves go in the compost. And so, like, yeah. I think it's a no-brainer. I think even though you don't necessarily want to compost them because the process of getting them requires smelting leaves and it doesn't feel like it would be effective compost, I still think it should be viable because they're organic. Even if they're dead, that's halfway to being compost anyway. So I think they should be compostable like most other organic things are.
I definitely agree on the solid surface. I think that any solid surface, like I'm thinking about a barrel, like you could even make it look like the barrel is full of leaves if you can cover the top of it with leaf litter. I like the idea of putting them on stone paths. And again, if you had them placeable on things like wood blocks or terracotta, then these gradients that I just mentioned become even more diverse. Like you can really do a range of browns with all the other things that you could put them on if they could be placed on wood blocks and things. And it is kind of strange to think that, as you're building a scene, there'd be leaves strewed on the ground, but they haven't landed on your picnic table or logs nearby or the wall. So that seems a little bit strange. And I like the idea of putting them on solid blocks. I don't know about the biome tint. It's one of those things where I like the brown. So do you treat them like coral? Like, so you see them in the world and they're biome tinted, but if you pick them up and place them somewhere or smelt them, then they turn into brown ones. Like when really smelting them would just disintegrate them. So like, I don't know like how you get around from going from green to brown, unless they all have a color that they keep, but then you end up with too many, right? So like having yellow ones from birch and flower forests and having the brown ones maybe be from the Badlands. So I don't know. I think out of those two options, I think I would prefer to have them on the solid piece. For me, the thing that I thought was an interesting feedback that I had instinctively was like, I don't like the name. I don't know how you feel about it, but the 80s kid in me just says litter is a bad word. Like to litter is deplorable. It's not a good thing. The next word association in my brain is kitty litter. And I know that they're going for some alliteration here, but like how was fallen leaves or dried leaves not on the name table for this? Leaf litter to me is just a little bit on the weird side for a name. And I'll also confess that as people that have to read the news every week, then having more tongue twisters in the news
yeah, right,
is not necessarily my favorite thing. So I may be a little biased there, but I do think that they could be a little bit more straightforward with the leaves, because it's not litter. Like it's a natural thing that happens. I think dried leaves or fallen leaves make much more sense than leaf litter. And I wonder, and I'm curious if anybody knows this, because we have an international audience, if it's a language thing, like if leaf litter is basically like what they're called in other languages. Like we would say fallen leaves or mulch or brush, that kind of stuff around here. But I don't know what French, Spanish, German, like what do they call fallen leaves all strewn around the base of a forest, right? So it could just be a translation thing, but I do find leaf litter kind of sits poorly with me as a name.
I mean, just looking it up on Wikipedia, there is an article entitled Plant Litter, which says also leaf litter, tree litter. It's a relatively commonly used term, but perhaps just not the most attractive one in this context. Yeah. And yeah, it feels odd to have leaf litter, but no other types of plant litter, I suppose. Maybe it's something that if there was an entire category of this, it would just feel like one extra addition, and it wouldn't feel quite so stark as a contrast in name compared to some of the other stuff that they've designed to feel a little bit more appealing, I suppose. So yeah, interesting piece of feedback. I think that's something I hadn't really considered. I was sort of neutral on the name. I just thought, well, that feels descriptive to me, and it is everywhere, so it does feel like something you have to clean up. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's something we can throw out to the audience and see if anybody else feels like they have a good alternative name for leaf litter. Write in and let us know. For now, though, that's where we'll wrap up our thoughts on the Snapshot and this episode of The Spawn Chunks. You can find more information about the show and links to some of the stuff that we've talked about today over at thespawnchunks.com. The music for the show is composed by me, and The Spawn Chunks is proud to be a listener-supported podcast. If you're getting some value out of the show, why not consider putting some value back in? You can visit patreon.com/thespawnchunks to join our community, where pledging at any level gets you an invite to our patrons-only Discord chat. You can listen to the show live when we record it in Discord every Monday. We also have monthly hangouts, quarterly hangouts, and other events in the Patreon calendar. That's all at patreon.com/thespawnchunks. We currently have 305 patrons, which is up 3 from last week. So thank you to the 3 of you for jumping on board. And special thanks go out to our content engineer patrons, which are Hunter555, Jumbo Sale, Mindtrip Media, Party Voyager, and Yitz. Thank you all for your support on this episode.
Sharing the podcast with your friends is the easiest way to support the show. It's free. Just poke a friend in the arm and say, hey, you should listen to The Spawn Chunks. You can find us at The Spawn Chunks on your social media platform of choice. New episodes are available on Mondays on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube, which is where you can find the video version of Jonny and I talking about the news and all of the things we cover on the show. You can email us at spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. The RSS feed is linked on thespawnchunks.com, and the patron-only RSS feed is on the Patreon page. That's where you can listen to the rendered distance, the extended version of the program.
My name is Jonny, but online I go by Pixelriffs. You can find most of what I do at youtube.com/Pixelriffs, where the Minecraft Survival Guide is currently in its third season. I also stream 3 days a week on Twitch, where I do behind-the-scenes work for YouTube and play a little bit of Elden Ring on the side these days. I'm also the voice of the unofficial Hermitcraft recap, which you can find through a quick YouTube search. And aside from that, I'm at Pixelriffs on both Blue Sky and Instagram. Joel, where can people find you online?
Everything that I'm doing online can be linked at joelduggan.com. That includes the Citadel Cafe, my podcast about sci-fi and fantasy entertainment. I have a fun documentary to talk about this week. Steven and I watched the Super Mario 3 documentary on Game Historian on YouTube, and there are several. So we're going to be covering a few of those over the next month or two. So look forward to that this coming Wednesday. I am Joel Duggan on Twitch, Joel Duggan on Twitter. I'm easy to find online. I stream Tuesday through Saturday at 1 o'clock Atlantic. That's UTC minus 4 hours, covering Stardew Valley lately. That's been new. Looking at other games as well. So trying to get into some different indie games this year. But I also, of course, play Minecraft and Satisfactory.
Thanks for visiting the Spawn Chunks. The world outside is infinite, but you should still pick up your litter.